This event tonight is sponsored by the Institute of Advanced Studies and the School of Earth and Environment here at UWA. We're very grateful for the support. Let me point out here at the beginning that the Gentilly Lecture was established in 2005 to honor the memory and intellectual legacy of an influential and long-serving scholar. Joseph Gentilly, 1912 to 2000, commenced teaching at UWA soon after arriving in Fremantle from Italy in 1939, and continued to be actively involved with the Department of Geography until 2000. During his long and distinguished career, Joseph Gentilly helped to bring about a comprehensive understanding of the climates of Australia. In addition to his other contributions, he wrote about the selective or greenhouse effect of the atmosphere more than 50 years ago, something we can find in a Geography of Climate, UWA, 1952. And more than 30 years ago was calling for an understanding of how climate patterns were changing, also to be found here, Australian Climate Patterns, 1972. This lecture is part of UWA's Research Week. Information on other events, and I'm sure you're aware of many of those during the week, is available in the foyer outside. And we really want to encourage everybody to tweet about it. So if you are into tweeting, hashtag UWA Research Week, all in ones. Let me also stress that tonight's lecture is being filmed and will be available very shortly on YouTube. So let's look forward to this. It is now my pleasure to introduce our Gentilly speaker for the evening, Professor Bruce Thom. Known as the founding father of the Australian Coastal Society, Ltd., Bruce Thom is Emeritus Professor in the Faculty of Science at the University of Sydney. In 2010, he was prestigiously awarded a member of the Order of Australia for his contribution to ecological management of the coastal zone and as a contributor to public debate on natural resource policy. Professor Thom is a founding member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, an independent group of Australian scientists, economists, and business people with interest in the conservation of Australia's land, water, and marine resources. It was established in 2002 with the objective of connecting science to public policy. So we already see the title up here. Let me just provide a little bit of a description here as an entry point. 5 themes in coastal science, personal reflections. As a physical geographer with somewhat eclectic interests, it has been Professor Thom's privilege to examine coastal problems at scales ranging from the early Cainozoic to day-to-day movement of sand on beaches. The range of interest extends further to shifts in climate, to biogeography, coastal policy and management, environmental law, and the role of politics in decision-making. To bring these interests together is a constant challenge, as many of you probably know, but it's a necessary one. Coastal Australia faces a raft of issues which requires a broad historical as well as a contemporary understanding across various spatial and temporal scales. These issues arise from changes in different drivers impacting directly on coastal environments, lifestyles, and livelihoods. Some attempt for sure must be made to apply scientific understanding as best as one can to the issues that those who use coastal resources face. Decision-making should benefit from that knowledge. However, this is not always the case. This lecture now will offer some personal examples and reflections of where coastal science has been of use, where it has been ignored, and where it could be of value for the future. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bruce Thom.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners, past and present. And I certainly wish to acknowledge Joe Gentilly. Joe, at this particular time, we have a lot of refugees moving through Europe and Asia. Joe was a refugee. He came to Australia in the 30s from a nation in Italy which was undergoing fascism. And he came to Australia. He came to Western Australia. And in doing that, he showed what a refugee can do for this country. He helped build this university. He made a contribution that we all are very proud of. And I'm extremely honoured to be in a position tonight to give this 2015 Joe Gentilly lecture. I want to develop this in terms of 5 themes that are part of my life over many years, for which many have contributed. And I am unfortunately not able to pay tribute to all those great people who've inspired me, those I've worked with, those who've suffered with me in various circumstances, and you might see examples of that as we go through this talk, and also particularly to pay tribute to my wife, who is here tonight, who has suffered probably the most in many ways in enduring my wanderings in over many years, what Peter Roy once called the rambling ambles with Wowser Thom. The 5 themes then pick up this to pick up this story, and they've given me another thing here. Let me see. Okay, let's see how this works. The 5 themes are these: geological evolution, morphostratigraphy, biogeomorphology, Morfa Dynamics, and coastal management. Let's start off with geological evolution. And I'm going to start in South Carolina. South Carolina is where I undertook my PhD work, but I had the great privilege of working with the South Carolina Geological Survey and further support from the US Geological Survey. But I was there because I was a student at Louisiana State University, and my work there was sponsored by the Office of Naval Research, the US Navy. So a combination of people and groups allowed me to work in South Carolina. But I see this as a starting point for tonight's lecture because it's a coast not unlike what you see in the Perth Basin, not unlike the evolution of the coastal plain of the Perth Basin, with the evolution in the Neogene, and that is the period covering the Miocene and the Pliocene into the Quaternary. And what I was working on with the team was the outer coastal plain in this particular section of South Carolina going into North Carolina. And the starting point is a scarp that runs along here called the Orangeburg Scarp. And that defines the outer from the inner coastal plain. And that scarp dates around the late Miocene, and seaward of that are late Miocene, Pliocene shoreline deposits, marine deposits going into the Quaternary. Those deposits range up to around about 70 metres above sea level at this particular point. They get higher to the north and lower to the south going into Georgia. It's a very important marker in the coastal plain history of the geology in the United States. But it's an emerging coast with the shoreline features that are so distinctively above sea level, ranging to that period. The eastern coast of Australia is quite different. This is the cliffs of Sydney. These are the cliffs of Triassic age, around about 240 million years old. And they're the youngest of the rocks of the east coast, the youngest of the rocks until you get into the very late Quaternary. There is no emergence here. This part of the continental margin, unlike the emergent part, which I talked about in South Carolina, this part on the east coast, ranging from north of the Gippsland right up into Queensland, is a subsiding coast. This margin has had no deposits of marine origin above present sea level until you get into the very, very late Quaternary. So it's a very different history. And when many years ago, Peter Cowell and I were thinking about, well, how did these cliffs evolve? And so fortunately, we were able to look at some seismic stratigraphy, and we started to think about a model of the evolution of that coast based on the seismic stratigraphy that many people had worked on over years, but they had mostly concentrated on the shelf wedge, the sediment wedge on the outer part of that continental shelf, which, as you can see, drops down to about 4,000 metres within a few hundred kilometres, within less than 100 kilometres from the shoreline. And so what we wanted to do was look at the seismic stratigraphy of that going back towards the coastline And we noticed there that you had valleys filled with sediment. But you noticed also that you had very little sediment, just a thin veneer of sediment compared to the wedge, on that inner continental shelf. And so we worked up this idea of a transgressive cliffing of the coast as the continental margin progressively subsided over that same period, over that Neogene period. And progressively, those river valleys that went out to the edge of that continental shelf and helped deposit that sediment wedge, as they got trimmed back progressively over that time period, and with that trimming, you saw the formation of the cliffs. That left behind a very, very broad abrasion platform that stretches all the way from southern New South Wales, cuts across the Paleozoic rocks, across the Sydney Basin rocks, across the Paleozoic rocks to the north, towards Queensland. The progressive sand cover in Queensland increases. And the reason for that is during the Quaternary, so much of the sands that have come out of the Eastern Highlands have been deposited on that platform, reworked during the Quaternary, ground down, got rid of all the softer minerals, leaving you behind the quartz that helps make up the great sand islands of southern Queensland. There's been that shunting of sand from south to north to make up the great islands of Fraser and Moreton and Stradbroke. And with that, of course, are those other very strong, stable minerals, rutile, ilmenite, and zircon, to help make the deposits of that area. So here we have two contrasting shelf types. One emergent, such as you see around here, seen in Carolina, and the subsiding continental margin that leaves behind a different record, but is translated today in terms of a sedimentary sequence that we see in the Quaternary. So that leads me now to look at morphostratigraphy. And morphostratigraphy essentially is the relationship between the surface morphological features and the stratigraphic record. And of course, it now opens up the opportunity for dating of various types, particularly as we get into the later Quaternary. And that dating, of course, helps give you the chronologies that are so important to understanding our sedimentary record and changes to our coastline. I'll turn first of all back to South Carolina. And as part of the work that we did there, we mapped the surface morphology of a range of features. The most easiest one to map at the beginning was the ridge and swale topography of the ancient shorelines that were so well preserved at this particular part of South Carolina. And the large stretch of fan-like ridge topography that you see there probably dates from the middle Pleistocene. We haven't got very specific ages on it other than it's post-Miocene, so post-Pliocene. The other ridge sequences that we see here are lower in elevation, and the last interglacial is along the back of Myrtle Beach, which I actually gave the name of as the Myrtle Barrier. Each one of these has back barrier deposits of clay sediment and makes a very, very interesting contrast to the sandy plains that you see defined there. One of the most interesting images that appeared in the US appeared in 1933 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Depression, commissioned air photography around vast areas of the United States to help with the planning and assisting the agricultural industry. This particular image appeared in 1933 and created all sorts of excitement because you can see that ridge and swale topography that I've just mentioned, that's in that older sequence, but you can also see a number of elliptical depressions with little white sandy rims around them, there and there and there. The Indians, local Indian people, called them precosins. A lot of the locals ended up calling them Carolina Bays. The US Geological Survey calls them raised rim depressions. Now, these particular features fascinated me, and although my supervisor at the time said, Bruce, do not touch them, get away from them, because at the time there's been an enormous controversy about their origin. When they were first seen, like on this photograph, people said, meteorites, comets. And some people said, no, they're spawning fish circles. And all sorts of crazy ideas evolved in the thinking of the US and have been published over a period of time. The famous geomorphologist Douglas Johnson wrote a book in 1939 where he talked about them being similar to oriented lake systems that we find in various parts of the world. I flew over the Linnets of Western New South Wales on my flight here. I saw the salt pans as I flew into Western Australia. You see them in the oriented lakes of Alaska. So you can explain these features in terms of processes, of waves, of winds, and in relationship to raised water tables. And I developed a hypothesis that I ended up publishing. And more recently, Helene Markovic from the US Geological Survey has obtained a whole set of optical stimulated luminescence datings which confirmed more or less the notion of these being formed during the last glacial period, particularly in stage 3 of that period, around about 30 to 45,000 years ago. I won't go into the detail. Her paper in Aeolian Geology, published earlier this year, is a classic in terms of synthesis of Aeolian work in eastern United States. Just another image of the Carolinas, these Carolina bays. They're so beautiful in the way in which they are formed, but the relationship of them to the topography, to the dune fields, have been well explained now. But let's turn now to work in eastern Australia. And of course, as I said, a lot of drilling has had to be done and a lot of exposures have had to be looked at. Unfortunately, the time I was working, the heavy mineral miners were active in eastern Australia. This is a section at a place called Coogin. It probably was the richest area of heavy mineral deposition, rutile and zircon here. And this area was mined 3 times. Fortunately, I saw it on the first pass. And you can see the ridge and swale topography that had just been cleared. You can see the dipping beds in here. This area is now under a very, very expensive piece of real estate. You can Google it. It's called casuarina. One part's casuarina, the other part's salt. And it's returning a lot of benefits to people besides income from heavy mineral miners. An area that I spent a lot of time in for many, many years is the area around Newcastle, looking at the morphostratigraphy of this embayment that stretches from Stockton north towards Port Stephens. And in this particular area, the 2 major bay barrier systems have been worked on. The innermost we called initially an inner barrier, and we're very, very fortunate to find, as a result of some dredging, right at this particular point there, 2 different species of corals that we were able to get uranium series dates that puts us back at the last interglacial, about 130,000 years ago. This is the first last interglacial aging that we have obtained in eastern Australia. This has been subsequent to that. So at least we know that the ridge pattern here, the ridge beach ridge pattern is here, but it's covered over by this blanket of sand, which has been reworked as a result of westerly winds, forming this dune field. And these are longitudinal dunes, which again we've been able to get luminescence datings on, and these are dated at the full last glacial period, around about 20,000, 25,000 years ago. So we've known that this dune field has been activated during the last glacial. The Holocene barrier system is here, and the Holocene ridge field is down in here, and it has been covered over by 3 transgressive dune systems that I have dated. It's been a mine of information, this particular embayment, and it highlighted for me the power of being able to drill, to be able to date, to be able to map, and to be able to get a story that really gave us a foundation in New South Wales for understanding the age and the chronology of sediment systems and where they may have come from. More recent work by a colleague of mine, Dean Patterson, is now generating modelling to try and explain the sediment systems a little bit more fully. From this work, we were able to obtain a generalised view of the nature of our different barrier systems and sand systems along the coast of New South Wales. And my first attempt in 1974 was to look at this in the context of the amount of sand that's available within an embayment, within these rock-bound embayments along the New South Wales coast. And I recognise that there are types that have been prograding, some prograding still today, mostly had stopped prograding at around about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Those that had been built up more or less vertically, what I call stationary. Those that are where sediment is deficit and the peat beds from the lagoons and estuarine deposits are outcropping on the beach face, receding barriers. Those where dunes are blowing inland, episodic dunes, and those which I call the mainland beach, where the sand is up against the rock. Now that was our very simplified version of what I saw back in the early 70s. 20 years later, a more complex version was published, and I'm honoured tonight to have in the audience one of the authors of the paper, Marie Ferland, who contributed very significantly to the expansion of this knowledge of the sediment systems along the coast, along with my very esteemed colleague Peter Roy, when we published this paper in '94. And one of the main changes here was the addition of information that we didn't have back in the 70s and 80s. It just took us a lot of time to get the information on the shelf, and it opened up my eyes again to the importance of going offshore, getting the information through the seismic record, doing the drilling, looking at the mapping, and building up that story from the offshore. And Marie worked with us, did her PhD at Sydney, and helped contribute to the recognition of these three extra, if you like, types that we recognised along that coast. Each one of the stories I'm giving you is a snapshot. There's a lot, of course, that sits behind all that. My other colleague, Peter Cowell, a brilliant man in terms of being able to model changes, recognised that he could simulate the changes over time with respect to these different types of sand units. And in this particular diagram from Peter's work, he's able to show that in two cases, the change associated with rising sea level and the onshore movement of sediment on a shallow inner shelf, less than 1 degree, where the shelf is greater than 1 degree, you get the onshore movement and then the offshore movement with sea level becoming stabilised. And that's the sort of area that Marie did much of her work on. The bottom one is the case when sea level is falling. This, of course, has been elaborated to some greater extent. I did have the pleasure of also doing some work in the 70s with the Royal Society in UK as part of an expedition to the Great Barrier Reef. The hypothesis there was that the platform reefs of the northern part of the Barrier Reef were very thin, and they sat on a Pleistocene coral base. No last interglacial was to be found along this coast at all. None. Where was the last interglacial? Was it deep, as some people had hypothesised, and the Holocene had grown up, or was it quite shallow? Well, we were able to get a barge and a drill rig and get in there and drill, and we found in two cases where we were able to do the drilling in the short time we had available that the Holocene was very thin, about 5 metres in this particular site on Bewick Island. We also had great fun on Bewick, sitting around, chewing the fat, talking about samples that we'd collected, looking at the materials that we were going to radiocarbon date, and generally enjoying ourselves in the sun, as you can see. The gentleman on the left there is Henry Polash, who was the doyen of radiocarbon dating in Australia back in from the late 60s onwards. And the chap who's smiling, the blonde-headed chap here, is probably one of the world's most famous coral ecologists, Charlie Veron, who I had the pleasure of being the bagman in diving under the water. And all I had to do was hold the bag out and he collected the corals. It was great fun. So that's life that you can have on the Barrier Reef. Now let's turn to theme 3, biogeomorphology. Biogeomorphology opens up the relationship between landform development, landform genesis, sedimentation, and ecological phenomena, ecological change, if you like. And it was very, very fortunate for me when I went to the United States in the 60s to be sent by the Coastal Studies Institute to walk around in the mangroves like this and get somewhat muddy, a bit different from the coral reefs, but especially to look at a deltaic complex in southern Mexico, in the state of Tabasco. This is in the Gulf of, as you see, from the Gulf of Mexico. And here we opened up this issue of how deltas evolve in the Holocene when you're looking at changes in the position of the outlet of major flows. In other words, the concept of switching delta position. It's a self-adjusting process that was very, very clearly understood from work that had been done in the Mississippi Delta. And one of the tasks that I had to look at was the distribution of mangroves in relationship to the age and distribution of these deltaic complexes, both the riverine and also the beach and sand ridge plain. The active delta today is here, the Grijalva-Usumacinta delta. The abandoned delta is the Mezcalapa delta over here, and the switch point here is at the town of Villahermosa. So at this particular time, the delta complex, when it was growing, protruded out, but it's been reworked by wave action, smoothed out, and you get a narrow barrier ridge with these lagoons in behind. The delta complex itself is slowly subsiding. Here is the active delta being built out here. Over here is the Isla del Carmen, and behind that is a barrier lagoon complex. Interestingly enough, no clastic sediments here. This is carbonate sediments, this carbonate ridge complex. So that's divorced from the sediment flow coming through here. But today, there is a sediment discharge coming in along the backside of the Laguna dos Terminos as there is a break in the Usumacinta. Now, the question that rises, what is the pattern of vegetation change like in this complex? The classic model, the classic ecological model is plant succession. One species followed by another species, leading to another species, finally ending up into a freshwater swamp complex. You move progressively seawards, the mangroves march seawards. Now that's repeated time and time again in the ecological literature. Quite clearly, I couldn't see that pattern except in one particular place. So I started to look at that relationship, that habitat relationship to landform conditions. And here is the case where you have active mudflat accretion, the mudflats are accreting, and you get that very nice succession. In fact, you have a plant called Baetis as the front colonizer, followed by different species of mangroves leading to progressively higher species as growth continues. But that's fine. That's the classic story. That's where you can find it, where you've got that active accretion. But you go to a place where you've got the old deltas being eroded, and what you find is, of course, the mangroves that have been established in that area. As the readjustment of landforms takes place, you've got active erosion and destruction along the shoreline. In the areas which are more stable in relationship to their landform position, you have the growth of a mangrove forest. And in this particular slide, if you look very carefully, you can actually see three species. I'm not going to point them out, but you actually have a fairly stable situation here. So drilling, again, geomorphologists, coastal environments have to drill. So we drilled, and in this particular wooded shoreline habitat, what did we find? We found a stable shoreline here. This whole area, an old levee system, a part of the older levees of the Mezcalapa Delta, an old levee here, covered by that Avicennia wooded habitat. And here along that shoreline, along the front, was a Rhizophora woodland with those prop roots, and that, growing on top of these old lagoon sediments, that had formed a beautifully compact peat. Beautifully compact, I remember, reddish-coloured, fibrous peat that smelt beautifully, as mangrove peats often do. So that kind of gave me the story of putting together habitats and communities of different types and linking their abundance with the different types of landform units. So we have the fluvial units, the lagoon strandline units, and the Gulf strandline units, where you have these abandoned features. So that pattern was something that I developed the story of and published that. And then I went and had a look at the similar situation, and the US Navy kindly gave me funds. I was living in Australia at the time. The US Navy kindly gave me funds to go and have a look at the Ord. So off Don Wright and I went to the Ord in 1971, and we did a number of things. I'll refer to something else in a moment. But one of the things I wanted to do was the same sort of thing that I did in Tabasco, but of course a very different geomorphic setting, Instead of its rising sea levels and switching deltas, we had a relatively stable sea level for the last 6,000 years or so, and we had big tidal range, up to 8 metres tidal range. And in that you get the deposition of sediments that come down the Ord. And so you see within that the areas of the dry flats here and the fringes of different species of mangroves. Here, much greater number of species than the 3 poor little ones that I had to deal with in Tabasco. So looking at that area, we also looked at the channels and channel topography associated with these meander bends. This is quite near Wyndham, the King River near Wyndham. And again, you start to see patterning of species in relationship to the point bars, what's happening along the cut bank side here, the nature of mangrove zonation that reflects inundation frequencies. Changes are going along these creeks, leading back to these flats, to these bare salt flats that are under water only at the very highest tides. Now that led to drilling and dating once more. And in that particular area of the King, we drilled a number of holes, and interestingly enough, one of the things that we found here was a continuous peat bed around about the present day mean sea level. And the dates, the radiocarbon dates that we obtained from that gave us some idea of a model that involved accretion at time of 6,000 years ago, widespread accumulation of mangroves, and then progressively as the flats developed with accretion, the mangroves died back from the broad flats and are confined to the edges. Joe Jennings had found something similar in the King Sound area, but hadn't put it together in a chronological sense. Many years later, along with John Chappell and Colin Woodruff, we went to the South Alligator River, and we actually found along the South Alligator peat stumps, old mangrove stumps, which dated around the same time. And in fact, we found virtually the same type of story, except in a somewhat different environment in which you had more fluvial input today. The story there was with sea level reaching its present position, mangroves accumulated as sea level rose, and then around about 6,000 years ago, you had this mangrove development that covered over this vast area of the flats, and then that was subsequently overcome by fluvial inputs coming in from the land, and that you get a floodplain over the top burying the mangroves and those stumps. And in course we dated that, and we've got a similar story that we got from the Ord. And so that led us to the concept of the big swamp. The big swamp around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, covering northern Australia. About 10 times, at least 10 times more mangrove coverage when sea level reached its present position for about 1,000 years than we have today. We've had a recession of mangrove, if you like, coverage of our tidal waterways through no other reason than a self-adjustment process of the system to the fluvial inputs, the changes in the sedimentation that have occurred over that time, a self-adjusting system that we saw in operation there. And that, of course, You didn't require sea level change, you didn't require climate change, you could explain it in that particular self-adjusting way. The broader model then of being able to relate mangrove systems to their geomorphic setting, I put together this particular story where I was able to put a story of where the mangroves could be found, where you've got a river-dominated system with active deltas compared to abandoned deltas, with the sort of thing we saw in the Ord, the tide-dominated system, the sand barrier system, which I looked at in the Laguna dos Terminos, the composite with got river and wave-dominated systems, and then the type of thing that we see in the east coast, the Hawkesbury Valley, for example, around Sydney, where we have the drowned bedrock valleys that have been flooded with sea level rise. Well, this takes me now to the story of morphodynamics. Now, morphodynamics, I inherited that term when Don Wright came to Australia to work with me in the Ord in the early 70s, and then when he joined Sydney University in 74, he of course brought that concept with him. It's the self-adjustment processes that I just made reference to in relationship to the South Alligator. And essentially it comes back to this very simple notion of where you have fluid motions, fluid processes at work, along with biophysical and geochemical processes, interacting with the sediment transport system over time and leading to a topography and a stratigraphy that in turn modifies and changes and adjusts the fluvial system, the fluid process system. And that kind of feedback loop is inherent in the morphodynamic concept. A lot of people who've worked in geomorphology and continue to work in geomorphology focus on this side of the graph. Others just focus on that. Very few look at this and look at the linkages and the feedback effect here. And this becomes very, very relevant, as I'll mention later on, when we start looking at the issues associated with planning and management of a dynamic coast. Because unless we fully understand how this is operating in time and space, in various places, we will overgeneralize, oversimplify, and create all sorts of difficulties with respect to the management of our coast, of which I'm now becoming more and more concerned about. But here's Don Wright in the Ord in 1971, where this was the first involvement I had with a process study. Don had brought out these instruments from the US to measure currents and to examine the flow regime and look at that in relationship to the sediment system. And of course, I extended that into the mangroves, as I just mentioned. So together we worked on this for quite a few months. I did a return trip with him at a later stage. But it was an exciting time to be able to work with somebody who had this very, very basic understanding of the physics of flow in estuarine systems. And as a result of that, we were able to show quite a number of things about how high tidal estuarine systems function. But there was another side of the morphodynamic story, and this one requires me to reflect, to take on board the reflections of another great friend of mine, Roger McClain. And the following few slides require some reading and these are the words of Roger McClain, but they become a little bit personal as we work this through. But essentially, it builds on this story of understanding processes, understanding responses, and working through our knowledge, working that knowledge up into a way that it can be translated into coastal management and coastal policy. So at the Australian National University, Canberra, in December 71, Bruce Thom is talking to a student. "Let's go," says Bruce, "down to the coast to do some beach surveys, and I'll be your host. Let's get away from Canberra, right out of reach, down to Maruya, down to the beach." "That was enough for me," the student said. "This man Bruce, he's got plenty of bread, and it is a chance for me to get ahead." So what was this PhD student's name? He comes from WA, and that is no shame. And he is someone who will later get fame, for this coastal student was no idiot. because his name was Ian Elliott. To do the survey, let's drive along the beach, so says Bruce. No worries, Ian, we'll be well out of reach of the rising tide that may come alongside, but we'll be well gone before high tide. So the project got started, its primary aim, to link beach process to form again and again. A fortnightly record should satisfy that aim. You can see the details on the survey frequencies there. But what can you offer us process folk? We know our dynamics, whilst yours is a joke. 2 weeks is too long for our instruments to hold sway. We need just a few minutes, at most a full day. Perhaps you're right, said Bruce in dismay, after hearing Chappelle burbling equations away, as well as Peter Cowell developing algorithms all day. So what do we offer you beach process folk? 2 things, retorts Bruce, and neither is a joke. First, dear colleagues, is the conceptual frame, for Morfa Dynamics is the name of the game. So we will persist with our empirical quirk and do our beach surveys. We will not shirk, for that is the reason for the Maria work. But that's not quite right, says a gruff McClain. Come on, Bruce, you know our primary aim was to get us and our families to the beach time and time again, and to get away from Canberra was in fact the main game. So tribute to Roger McClain. So from that work, 4 general conclusions, 4 outputs came from that work in various forms. One which Andy Short and Don really developed very, very strongly as a result of observations there and Andy's work at Collaroy Narrabeen, was the so-called Australian beach model of the different beach types, and being able to link each type to a process regime. And of course others, students following from Andy and Don, have developed that even further. The second thing was the result of those observations. We started, as I said there, in 71. In fact, Ian and I set up the first set of observation points, which remain to this day. McClain continues them on. And that tells a wonderful story. It's the oldest story of its type, probably one of the oldest now in the world, where you look at the foredune through to the beach, to the near shore. And those observations, by the way, are being undertaken on a voluntary basis, no grant, no research grant, no OH&S approvals, just go out and do it. And that's how it's been done ever since we started. But you can see there that there's a story, and that story links to, that story links to the changes that took place in the 70s with that extraordinarily strong La Nina event. That La Nina event led to the erosion of that shoreline position, went back 80 odd metres. We lost around about 250 cubic metres per metre run of beach, and over that period of time. But it wasn't just one event, one storm, it was the clustering of storms during that particular period. Extraordinary period. And we were just so fortunate, this is where serendipity in science comes in, just so fortunate to have started that work with the insights of Ian Elliott back here. Thank you, Ian, very much for that, for pushing me along. And starting it then and continuing it through this period with Roger McClain and Jaishu Chen, continuing it through, picking up the various storm events that have occurred, but no repeat back to this particular storm event here. So this becomes the storm period of record that has now been used to assess the impacts of shoreline change along that New South Wales coast. If we were working to southern Queensland, it would be a slightly different, because the 1967 event was extraordinarily big in 67. 5 tropical cyclones, 1 east coast low in 67 hit the Gold Coast and northern New South Wales at that time. So this is the second output. This is the second output. To have that story, to have that record, be able to interpret it, be able to tell what that means in terms of shoreline loss, shoreline recovery. So within this embayment, you're able to see recovery post-storm. No sediment loss from that system. It's a recovering system. Even though we've had we've had sea level rise during this period, slightly, but that's not seen in this record at all. This is where I have to refer to Joe, because at the time I started this work, I wanted to try and think in terms of the climate systems that are changing and that are linking back to the way in which you get these storm events and the impact of these storm events. And Joe Gentilly had presented, as we heard from earlier today, had presented a whole raft of knowledge to the Australian climate world about our climate systems and how they were behaving. And so when I started to see these events unfolding in the 70s, I thought up a climate model, a very simplified climate model that required me to work closely with the Bureau of Meteorology for several weeks to look back at the records and try to understand what had happened over time. And 1950 became a period of reference. There were clusters of storms in 1950. And a chap by the name of Korelski in the Bureau had put together an incredibly detailed story studying all the synoptic charts. And from that I ascertained the notion that you get this period when you get cyclogenesis in the Tasman Sea as a result of a blocking high system over here deviating the flow of the jet streams and allowing, with high sea surface temperatures, cyclones to occur. A very simplified picture that I put together in 78 based on how these East Coast lows could form. It's a great pleasure to know that there's people now like Ian Goodwin who have taken this enormous step forward to understand the climate-ocean interaction, to understand just what types of East Coast lows are doing what sort of things in terms of shoreline change. An incredible addition to our knowledge, which Ian is currently publishing, and I pay tribute to the work that he and his colleagues, including people from the Bureau, are undertaking. So that's the third output. The fourth is where we really now get into the nuts and bolts of how sediment transport in relationship to time and change along a coast, an embayed coast such as we have in Eastern Australia. And what we see here is, in a simple sense, is two models, one dealing with an embayment which you can call closed, another which you can call leaky. Now, so the Maruya type situation is in a closed embayment. And you can see here the sediment transport with storm effects and so on is on offshore. We're not getting any leakage from around any of these headlands. Everything is taking place in an on-offshore direction. So you lose sediment through a storm cluster, and then you have a recovery period. Then you lose again. But the basic sediment system in the dunes, on the beach, stays around the same. But in this particular case, you've got a longshore loss of sediment. And this sediment loss, due to the transport through wave action, is alongshore as well as having on offshore. And overall then, at a particular place like this, where you've got no sediment coming around this headland, this is a trap. So this particular embayment is a net loser. It's in sediment deficit. You're losing that sand into that embayment. So you're starting to see a trend in this particular direction. And of course, we have those particular cases. And these cases now are starting to cause a lot of grief. A lot of grief to locals, a lot of grief to state politicians, a lot of grief to Treasury, a lot of grief to people like myself who feel that we have to have a clearer understanding of the system before we allow property development and whatever has happened. Now, it further is complicated by the legal system. And in the introduction, it was referred to that I have got an involvement in environmental law. I've had to, because the legal system dictates the management processes and the management systems. There is, under Torrens title, there is a view that you never lose your title. You never lose your title. If it goes off into the sea, you still own it under Torrens title. So in this particular case, this landowner here had a title boundary way out here. And he felt he had the right to protect his property and dump rocks. Higgledy-piggledy dump rocks. Right? And he did that without any permission. He did it because he said, I'm on my property. I own the beach. Right? It's mine. Right? Now, that is an interesting view, and it's held quite a few times. I had a paper published last year in The Conversation, Who Owns the Beach? Because Lindsay Fox in Victoria made a claim, a legal claim, to stop people moving along his beach in Port Phillip Bay. A person in Gold Coast put up barriers along the Gold Coast. She owned that part of the beach, and she put barriers up. I had a person in Bateman's Bay who called the police to evict people off the beach because he owned the beach. The police, fortunately, just decided not to appear. But this particular issue arises because we in Australia do not have the same legal common law that exists in the UK. In the UK, if you can establish that the high water mark has moved landwards, that reverts to the Crown, automatically reverts to the Crown. The Crown always owns the beach. But for some reason, we've allowed Torrens title and right line boundaries to overcome the common law interpretation in Australia. The US gets a bit more complicated because of the introduction of the public trust doctrine and how that works in different states. But the basic situation in the US is much more like the UK and less like the Australia. But having said that, we're still confronted in the US, non sequitur, US, with this particular situation. Here we have a lawyer on duty on a beach because the priorities of a private beach are different from a public beach. So the lawyer has to be on duty. And we have lawyers. We have lawyers in New South Wales who are being signed up by landowners along the beach to do exactly that, to exercise landowner rights over the public interest. So it opens up this question now for me as to coastal management and where I've got to with respect to coastal management. Theme 5. Well, coastal management for me started in 1989. And it started in two ways. One, I was appointed to chair the New South Wales Coastal Council, which I did for 13 years. But two, I was invited to present, along with Graham Pearman and others, to the first Prime Minister's Science Council on the 6th of October 1989. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, and he was in the chair, and he spent all day with us. And I presented on the coastal scene. Now, it's incredible to note how much information, how much science was given to the Prime Minister, documented in 1989. After Hawke left being Prime Minister and Keating became the Prime Minister, things changed enormously. So don't just think that our interest in climate change, or lack of it, is a matter of the coalition. It can also be a matter of the Labor, and it was exercised through the years of Keating. So, but at least in 1989, we had the chance to do a lot of presentation. And one of the things that we presented in 1989 was this sea level information, 1989. If you look, I won't go into the details of this diagram, except to look at that green curve. Remembering we're starting relative to 1986, and we're projecting forward to 2100. If you look at that green curve, that's more or less where the IPCC 2000 and whatever it is, 14, was placing us on one of their scenarios. It hadn't changed much. That information was available for decision makers through the federal government at that time and then dropped. And then dropped at the federal level. Picked up by some states. New South Wales picked this up. If you look at the Coastal Manual, 1990, it picks up this. And one of the reasons for it was the Engineers Australia picked it up. And Engineers Australia have run with that ever since these dates. And we're very fortunate to have such a wonderful body of professional engineers who've been prepared to keep the momentum going in this sort of thinking. But we even went one step further in 1989. We even took different sea level scenarios, if you like, from a planning perspective. What sort of curve can you use in relationship to developments for open space versus residential development versus high-rise? What sort of thinking should go into what we now call planning allowances. We had that concept back in '89. Again, it didn't go anywhere at that time. It's now coming back. It's now coming back. We also at that time started to recognise the different behaviour of the coasts of Australia for their different settings. Not one single setting, not one uniform application of Brun rule or whatever you want to call it. You had different geomorphic settings that behaved in different ways. Whether it be the northern, with its mangrove fringe, its high tides and so on, its eastern, with its sand ridges, or the sort of situation, of course, that we have down here in the southwest, with the limestone reefs and the sand and the limestone ridges. So we had that understood. We were articulating, as if you like, a policy perspective back there in '89. Now we've gone many steps further, and here in Western Australia it's of tremendous benefit. We're starting to see how people in WA, through the work of groups led by Matt Elliott and the Damara team, have been able to show how you can divide the coast up into compartments, primary, secondary, tertiary, and understand the different types of responses that are necessary in each of the compartment types. How you think about the scale of investment. So in a primary level, you must look carefully at large-scale engineering works in terms of change. As you go down to secondary, you talk about regional planning and engineering decisions. And at the tertiary, you're looking at more detailed impact studies. And it's very, very good that people in WA now are doing this type of work and thinking about it in the planning context. We're trying to push this nationally through the national scheme, and it's pleasing to note that at least Greg Hunt, as Minister for the Environment, recognises this and has allowed me to put something on the Department of Environment website, which puts a broad policy perspective on the Department of Environment website, and we're pursuing that now more specifically with Matt's help through NCARF, the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. So more will come out of this because there's a greater feel for this, and Geoscience Australia has now mapped Australia into primary and secondary compartments, and we hope to build on that story. So in conclusion, some lessons from all this. Firstly, science matters, or does it? Well, it does and it doesn't, but mostly it doesn't. When it gets down to the high-level cabinet-making decisions, it doesn't. Why? Because we think long-term. We think in terms of decades to even centuries. Not like the Dutch. The Dutch and the Germans are thinking for 2300 in terms of planning for sea level rise. Can we get them to even think to 2050, let alone 2100 at state or federal level? It's very, very, very hard because the priorities within our cabinet system, within our adversarial type of parliament, is to think short term, what's politically advantageous at the time. More important to put beds into hospitals, more important to build up the schools, more important to have cops on the beat, more important to build the jail system up. We can do that now. We can satisfy you, the electorate, now. To think in terms of some of the things like building infrastructure in places which are going to be resilient to sea level, 2100, wow, that takes a lot of courage. We also have this issue of public versus private, which I've alluded to already. There are winners and losers. And the sort of talk that I introduce into the public debate and into the political debate is that the public should win more than it does. But you talk to the politicians who are influenced at local government level or at state level, no, the private property owner must. You cannot lose private property. It's sacrosanct. But the sea wants to invade. In the UK, that's not a problem. The 1949 Act, Coastal Act in the UK, allows for that to happen, allows for non-intervention, and causes difficulties to people if they try to stop the sea from doing its thing. If an individual does that, they'll get fined. Right? But we go the opposite way, and there's a lot of case law behind that. And I've been into the court and tried to defend this, and currently working with the New South Wales government to try to build up a more robust legislative basis for giving the public The public trust doctrine in the United States provides a lot more strength than we have. If you look at Australian common law and the use of the public trust doctrine, it's ignored. It's a US thing, I'm told by lawyers. In fact, I had one article refused in an Australian environmental law journal because I wrote about the public trust doctrine. They said, no, you can't publish that. That's a US stuff. We're not interested in it. Fortunately, another journal published it. But that's the kind of thinking that exists. Political champions come and go. By gosh, we need political champions. Somebody who stand up for the long term. Somebody who's interested in our children and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. We don't have many politicians who are interested in that. I can assure you. Have put that before them, despite the fact that they've got children and grandchildren, many of them. They don't want to think in terms of the future. Future doesn't vote, I'm being told by several politicians. It doesn't vote. It won't help me get back. Huh? I'm not being cynical, this is what I've encountered. And it's hard. But every now and again, a politician arises who goes beyond that sort of thinking, that does want to look at the longer term. We had one at the federal level, who I refer to many, many times, Robert Hill. He fought the cabinet to get the EPBC Act up. He took the money from the Natural Heritage Trust and invested it in coast, 120 odd million over 3 years. He took that. Why? He was on the left of the Libs. They hated him. But one thing he could do that Howard wanted, he could control the Senate. And it's so important when you have a political champion to have other powers that he can wield over his colleagues. And I've learnt a lot about how that works. Frustrating as all hell is changing faces in bureaucracy. So since 2008, I've worked with the federal government. The groups that I've worked with, I've had 5 different groups of people to work with and provide information. I had one senior bureaucrat who looked at me in amazement and said, "Sand, does it move?" And I had to go to the whiteboard and go through first principles. And yet she was the person who took the briefs to the minister. Huh? She left, went off somewhere else, another one replaced, another one, and so on. And it's hard. Disintegrated coastal zone management, not integrated coastal zone management. The silos are alive and well, and they don't talk to each other. They can, if you can get through in a particular way and you work hard enough at it, they can do it. But hard. It's hard work because they want to protect their turf, and they do. And that often means that roads will be built in places where they shouldn't be. No, they shouldn't be. Or national parks, wanting to protect its caravan park, will dump rocks on the beach. Don't talk to anybody who knows anything about the science of that beach. No way. We got to protect that toilet block. That's more important than the beach. And those rocks are just loose, and those rocks will float around, and people that get hurt. And we've had examples of that. So this is a continual fight. We aspire to integrated coastal zone management, but we live in the world of disintegrated coastal zone management. But science must continue to inform the policy and the law. We cannot let the bureaucrats, the policy wonks who come and go to do what we, who understand the systems, know about and really feel as important enough to inject into that policy domain. So right now we're trying in New South Wales, we have a coastal expert panel, which I'm a member of, along with Angus Gordon and Ron Cox, and we are being encouraged by the Minister, Rob Stokes, to provide that input and to be able to inform. But all the time there's feedback coming back to us. No, we don't want that. You don't want to hear that. But we're there. And that is where I come to the need for passion and persistence. Of course, in Joe Gentilly, we see a man who is infused with passion and infused with a need to continue to persist despite all the adversaries that were against him or made life difficult from the time he left Italy when he came here. Joe had that passion and persistence, but we who work in this domain, where we need science to be translated into good public policy, looking after the public good, at the same time assisting economic development and providing for the cultural conditions that we find so important. Looking after those lifestyles, looking after those livelihoods. It can be done, but science has to be in there. It has to be fighting. We have to continue it. and I hope all of you will be in a position to help do that sort of thing as we move forward into this the challenging years ahead of us. Thank you very much.